Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to the Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. My name is Zhang Yongwei, and I'm the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. This year's Griffin Lecture comes at the time when the Chinese New Year is right around the corner. This year is the year of the tiger, but it's a special year of the tiger. It is the year of the golden tiger. It happens only once every 60 years. On top of that, the first day of the 2010 Lunar New Year falls on the 14th day of February, which is also the St. Valentine's Day, a day of romance and love. At this special moment, on behalf of everyone at the China Center, I would like to extend the best New Year's greetings to all of you. Our best wishes go to you and your family for lots of love, peace, prosperity, and success in the coming year. Happy Chinese New Year, 春节好. We have prepared a reception after the lecture that features some nice Chinese food for you, and we invite you to celebrate the Chinese New Year with us. You must have noticed the Red Pockets bulletin board at the entrance as you walked in. The Red Pocket Appeal is the China Center's annual solicitation of funds to support scholarship for U of M students to study in China. Last year, we received over 30 applications from our students, and over 1/3 of them received scholarships of various amounts. In the next 1 or 2 days, could be tomorrow, you will receive the Red Pocket Appeal letter from us. There are also red pockets, the 红包, on that table as you walked in. If you don't know, if you're on our mailing list, you don't know whether you will receive our letter, please pick up an envelope. Please be generous and make a pledge today or after you receive the letter. We're grateful for your support to our students. Our speaker today is Ambassador Burton Levin. We're deeply honored to have Mr. Levin here this afternoon to give a speech on topics that are related to China and U.S.-China relations. We will have plenty of time for questions afterwards, so I hope that the audience will take the opportunity to interact with Ambassador Levin. Today's event, the 9th Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lectures, is made possible by a generous gift from Mr. Bob Griffin and his wife, Kim Griffin. Bob and Kim donated $500,000 to the China Center to create an endowment fund and to establish the Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. Griffin's gift reflects their commitment to promoting mutual respect between the two countries and their passion to connect people with China. Since its inception, this lecture series has presented many well-respected and widely recognized China experts to the University of Minnesota campus and its community, and has drawn hundreds and thousands of audience of different backgrounds. The Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture has become one of the most important events that the University of Minnesota China Center hosts each year, and it has generated tremendous interest and great impact in the Twin Cities community. We're deeply indebted to Bob and Kim Griffin for their generosity and their contribution. Judd Sheridan is president of China Center's Advisory Council. He is also Norwegian Centennial Interdisciplinary Chair and Professor Emeritus of Genetics at Cell Biology and Development in the College of Biological Sciences. It is my pleasure to ask Judd to introduce our speaker today. Please welcome Professor and Dr. Judson Sheridan. Thank you.
I have to use my notes. I don't have anything on. Well, anyway, I'm sorry. That's just a joke for some of you to understand. I have a distinct pleasure and also a challenge to introduce today's lecturer. I know he is known to a number of you, if not many of you. I only met him last night at dinner, and I can tell you he's a fascinating person. And what I have to say will only capture just a little bit of what he's done in his long career and continues to do in his continuing career. But I'm going to start with just providing a welcome of my own on behalf of the China Center Advisory Council. And I'm glad that Yongwei used a slightly different Chinese version of this greeting that you've all heard, Gong Xi Fat Sai. Now, that probably is so badly pronounced that the laugh is because of that. But nevertheless, I hope the sentiment is very clear, which, as I understand it, generally says, congratulations, may you have a prosperous year. I also understand that often Chinese children, at least in the past, maybe even now, will take that greeting and immediately follow it up with, and where is the red pocket? Or Hong Bao, you see, Hong Bao Na Lai. Now, that's the last Chinese you're going to get from me. So, but I just want to emphasize, before I say a few words about the China Center Advisory Council, that what Yongwei was presenting as a very important appeal from the China Center, and it's been an annual appeal, is extremely significant in providing support for students that travel and study in China. And I can't think of any better way to develop bridges with China than to have students experience the richness of the culture and get the educational experience. And so we hope that you will take some time to pass by and pick up a red pocket and send it in according to the instructions. Please be generous. The students will be very appreciative. So let me just say a couple of words before I begin further introducing today's speaker about the China Center Advisory Council. The China Center Advisory Council has been in place essentially as long, in fact, technically maybe even before the China Center actually started. It was one of the founding units of establishing the China Center, and that means it's about 30 years old. It has the mission to advise the China Center director, to build bridges between the center and the faculty and the academic units at the University of Minnesota, and very important, to strengthen connections between the university and the community, both at the private sector, industrial sector, and the friends of the university. It's comprised of representatives from the University of Minnesota academic programs and departments. It also has representatives from the corporate sector and friends from the community. And this has had a long history, as you can tell from the 30-year history, of supporting the activities of the China Center. And this is one of the types of activities that is so important to the China Center, to the university, and highly supported by the CCAC, which is what we call it in shorthand. Now let me continue with a bit of an introduction. And I say a bit because you've already had a chance to read. It's an abbreviated version of what he has accomplished, what Ambassador Levin has accomplished in his career, but it is already rich and full. And what I am going to do is to just pull out a couple of specific areas in which where he's had experience and where he's contributed. And it kind of provides a bit of a theme from my perspective that sort of connects several of these things that he's been doing. And the theme, I've termed the theme serving in interesting times. You've maybe heard the parallel phrase to that. And I'm sure the ambassador would say that whatever I've chosen, there were many other interesting times, quite beyond what I've picked out. But the three of them stand out for me, and I think they're fascinating. One of them is that just shortly after, in fact, the next year after he joined the Foreign Service, he was posted in Taiwan, and the agreement, the Formosa Resolution of 1955, was signed. And that's the agreement between the United States and Taiwan for the United States to support Taiwan in the case of military interaction from outside, mainly from across the channel. And I think Ambassador Levin may say a few words about that. I don't know, but certainly I think we'd agree that that was an interesting time. Then later he was the Consul General in Hong Kong. And in fact, that began his, I would say, almost a love relationship with Hong Kong. He was back several times during the year. But he was there, again, at an auspicious time. He was there at the time that the agreement was signed between the United Kingdom, between Great Britain, I guess, at that point, Great Britain and the People's Republic of China, to ultimately revert the governing of the Hong Kong back to the People's Republic under a particular formula, that included making sure that there would be one country but two systems, and so that provided a separation and a continuation. And I'm sure we may hear a few things about that too, but certainly I think we'd agree that's a pretty interesting time. But I think by far the most interesting time is the time that he spent in what he initially was Burma and then ultimately became Myanmar. And some of you at least will know, and I had to find out more about it, I might add, that during the period of, in 1988, basically, shortly after he arrived as the ambassador to Burma, there was a major uprising, and the major uprising was focused on trying to bring democracy into the country. Well, it was a horrible time, and it was a time in which people were being killed. The whole event was put down very substantially and very vigorously, and yet after a certain period of time, and they changed the name and a few other things of the country, there was enough activity still in the democratic movement to convince the military junta at the time regime, which has continued to date, to actually have an election. And this was the first real free election, apparently, that had happened in that country for a long period of time. And the opposition party won by an absolute landslide. And you've heard the name of the person who became the real hero of that time period, because Aung San Suu Kyi received the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of her steadfast nonviolent approach to trying to bring democracy into the country. And not only was she an important figure then, she continues to be an important figure because she's in and out of house arrest at the current time, even some of this because of her own interests and decisions. And she's a very good friend of the ambassadors. But I think the most fascinating point, and it's the last one I'll mention about this time period, is that while the killing was going on and the massacres were happening, the ambassador opened the doors of the embassy, and contrary, as I understand it, and I hope I'm not speaking out of class here, contrary to federal policy or foreign service policy, opened it for students and monks and maybe as many as 100 or more whose lives basically were saved as a result of his action. I think that characterizes the inner workings of the ambassador. So, as I said before, I think that these are just a few of the interesting times. The ambassador probably has more to say about others, but I think they may surface while he talks to us about the relationship between U.S. and China and how this relationship has been marred by misperceptions. Please welcome Ambassador Burton Levin.
Thank you, Judson. I think it's remarkable for somebody to be on a China center and a Norwegian center at the same time. This is only in Minnesota could that happen. It is a pleasure to be here, a particular pleasure to take refuge from the rigors of a real winter, a New England winter, and to come to Minnesota and enjoy such a beautiful day. I'm the first person who comes here in the middle of February and gloats over the warmth and comfort. Judson mentioned a couple of things, and just very briefly on some of these points. My allowing the monks and students into the embassy kind of shows my Chinese side of my soul. The Western side, the American side, there's laws, there's regulations, and our laws and regulations are not to allow asylum in our embassies. And the fear is, of course, if you allow asylum, and particularly in Latin American countries or some other countries where there's instability, you're just going to be flooded day after day after day. You're going to get people coming in seeking asylum. But here was a case where there were lives at stake. It wasn't a very difficult decision, I must say. But on the Chinese side, there's the law, and then there's the human emotion, 人情, and that's where my Chinese side came in, and I wasn't going to let those kids and monks to the mercies of the Burmese army, so that's another thing. On the Hong Kong issue, I was going to get to this later, but Judson mentioned it, so I'll just start right off. The Hong Kong issue is another example of how, in my opinion, American misperceived China. If you recall, now some of you are so young, you have no way of recalling, but to not even to my peers, even to the younger generation, somewhat younger than I am, it was almost unanimous that Hong Kong, once taken over by China, would be reduced to ruin. I think scarcely, it was almost every newspaper, the New York Times thundered with editorials, everyone was under the impression or believed that Hong Kong could not survive a PRC takeover. I argued back with the Department of State, with Washington, with the government. I said that I thought Hong Kong would be perfectly fine after 1997. And my argument was very simple. I think during the Cultural Revolution, when China was tearing itself apart, when China was going almost berserk, and here was Hong Kong, the symbol of China's humiliation, the Opium War, Hong Kong a product of the Opium War, which every Chinese regards as the beginning of this period of 150 years of humiliation. Hong Kong was the symbol of that. And yet, during the height of the Cultural Revolution, China left Hong Kong alone. And it could have collapsed Hong Kong, killed Hong Kong, by some very simple means. It could have shut off the water. Hong Kong was almost totally dependent on water from China. It could have cut off food exports. Hong Kong, again, relied heavily on food exports from China. And simply by saying, it's time, we want it back, you would have had a flight of business leaders and capital that would have made the Hong Kong economy unsustainable. It would have imploded. They didn't do it. They didn't do it at their most radical, frenzied time. They left Hong Kong alone because Hong Kong represented, at that time, virtually the only source of foreign exchange for the People's Republic of China and the only source of contact with the outside world. Here, we're in the 1980s. Britain raised the issue of 1997, not the Chinese. Britain wanted to deal with it. My position was very clear. Number one, China is now economically developing. Its most important objective is economic development. This is 2 years after the Deng Xiaoping reform program of 1978. It focuses on development. Hong Kong represents a major source of foreign investment within China. It is a major source of technology for China. More importantly, Chinese self-esteem is involved. The last thing the Chinese want to do, coming out of that Cultural Revolution, finally beginning to get things right, the last thing they want to do is to take this cosmopolitan commercial center and turn it into a garbage dump. They would lose prestige. They would lose prestige in the eyes of their own people, and it would be internationally, it would be very damaging to the Chinese. And finally, the whole question of Hong Kong, one country, two systems, had an obvious and major relevance to the question of Taiwan. They are trying to persuade Taiwan that reunification with China will not affect Taiwan in any way adversely. And imagine if they take over Hong Kong and turn it into a mess, what that does in terms of their hopes for a peaceful, what they call peaceful reunification of Taiwan, it would just blow them to smithereens. So these, to me, were obvious reasons why Hong Kong would go, would succeed, while China would be ultra cautious in dealing with Hong Kong. And of course, that has been the case since 1997. It's what? It's 15 years now? Nothing major has changed in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is flourishing. You go to Hong Kong, and I go there quite often. It's not all that different from what it was pre-1997. There's no sign of the PRC imposing its will or changing any of the systems or impinging on any of the personal liberties. It's Hong Kong the way Hong Kong used to be. And yet, here was congressional opinion, editorial opinion, most Americans thinking, oh, those Chinese communists, they are going to ruin Hong Kong. So this is one of the misperceptions. I want to say that this U.S.-China relationship, I'm not going to go into any of the specific problems now bedeviling this relationship. When we come to questions, Q&As, I'd be more than pleased to try my hand at some of them. What I want to do is provide a foundation, an underpinning of what moves the United States as it shapes its China policy. And I've been involved with China for now 60 years. I started as a 2-year-old. Anyway, I began studying Chinese in Chinese history as an undergraduate at the urging of a professor who told me that China is going to be very important to the United States. And although the Korean War was underway, that in a few years after this war was over, then the U.S.-China relationship would be extremely important. And he got me interested, and subsequently I went to Columbia in 1952. That's where I began to study Chinese, at Columbia University, at a graduate level. There were almost no undergraduate Chinese language classes in the United States in 1940s and 50s. That's how unimportant China was in terms of the United States perception. It just wasn't there. The hope for the future is that I now have a 6-year-old granddaughter who started kindergarten at the age of 4.5 in Minnetonka in a Chinese immersion program. She's starting at the age of 4.5. I started at the age of 22. Her Chinese now is better than mine, but I'm getting old. Anyway, the relationship is the most important for either of these nations. On one hand, here's the United States, a superpower with all the problems, perhaps a disturbed superpower, but nonetheless a superpower. And here is China, the most populous country in the world, a rising power, and how these two nations interact are really going to shape the lives of the citizens of both countries, and indeed the lives of many others through the world. And as I looked at all the issues between China and the United States, all countries have differences. Countries operate on the basis of national interest. And countries have different interests. And so there are always disputes, differing opinions, and all of that. The most important thing is to deal with these issues without a surrounding envelope of emotionalism, without preconceptions, without attitudes that generate further misunderstanding and prevent reasonable compromise. And as I look back on my involvement over the years with China, one of the things that really comes to me quite loudly, and I'm talking from an American perspective. Later on, I'll say just a few things about a Chinese perspective. It's more difficult for me to talk from a Chinese perspective because I'm not Chinese. Anyway, there has been some terrible misreadings on the part of the United States of China and what it is. And it has created some very serious and harmful consequences. The Korean War, I won't get very much into that, and both sides, the historical archives are now open, and it's quite clear that both on the part of China and both on the part of the United States, there were dreadful misreadings of each other's intentions. And one of the reasons for this misreading of intentions, there was no contact between these two governments. There's absolutely, they went through a third party whom the United States did not trust. And what happened there is the Chinese were convinced that we'd go sweep up through North Korea into China, and we were convinced that the Chinese would realize that we had no intentions of doing so, and therefore that we could avoid conflict. Well, there was conflict. There was conflict for many years, and it was based on misreading on both sides. Now, get down to the Vietnam War. Many of you young people, Vietnam is like the Peloponnesian Wars. But it was the reason why we went into Vietnam, one of the most important reasons why we went into Vietnam, was to stop Chinese expansionism. I don't know if some of you older people remember that. It was a test of the thesis of wars of national liberation. Here were the Chinese supporting Vietnam, talking about day in, day out wars of national liberation, and we took this all very seriously. We saw North Vietnam as a puppet of China, and the North Vietnamese effort to conquer South Vietnam as part and parcel of this great Chinese expansionism and this ideological concept of wars of national liberation. If the Chinese would triumph with this wars of national liberation in Vietnam, then the whole third world would be aflame with Chinese-sponsored wars of national liberation. And you may not remember this, but this was a major argument for our deepening involvement in Vietnam beginning 1965-66. And what was China doing in beginning in 1966? Tearing itself apart. The idea that the Chinese were a major threat could command the support of the third world at a time when China was rent with fanaticism, factionalism, and was barely surviving. And yet, this was a major element of the United States calculation into going into Vietnam. 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese were killed. 3 years after we left Vietnam, China and Vietnam were at war with each other. And here we had gone in because of the Chinese factor. So if there ever was a greater misreading of reality, I've yet to encounter that. Now, you have in this relationship with China and the U.S., there's been just a whole series of ups and downs, ups and downs. You have George Herbert Walker Bush coming into office right in the aftermath of Tiananmen. Bush Sr. had been in China. He had run the liaison office. He was very much advocate of improved U.S.-China relations, but in the aftermath of Tiananmen, he could not do very much about it. You have Clinton coming in. His first term, his campaigning was against Bush's policy on China, talking about being too close with the butchers of Beijing, if you remember that, and constant, unremitting Clinton administration criticism of China on human rights. Threat after threat after threat until toward the end of his first term, the beginning of his second term, U.S. business interests, which by then were becoming more and more deeply involved in the China situation, plus, I guess, the passage of time from Tiananmen, plus the fact that in a year or two after Tiananmen, it was evident that the tragedy of Tiananmen was not going to bring in its way a reversion to an ideological state. That whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation, and mind you, if you watched that on television, you had to have deep feelings on it. But nevertheless, 3 years afterward, it was quite clear that China was re-embarked on a policy of reform. And then Clinton administration, the second term, a much better relationship with China. Then came George W. Bush. When he got into office, he is quoted in the Woodward book, Bush at War, this Washington Post correspondent, Woodward. He is quoted shortly after taking office as saying, the three greatest threats to American security are terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and China. Now, this is a man who was surrounded with neoconservatives, with these visceral anti-communists, with these very strong pro-Taiwan group, people who favored Taiwan independence, and this was a man speaking out on China. When he took office, my greatest fear was that, particularly on the issue of Taiwan, that the United States and China would have a relationship marked at best, by a Cold War atmosphere, and of course, at worst, by actual hostilities. What saved it was the act of these fanatics who flew 2 planes into the World Trade Center. With that, American policy immediately refocused on the Middle East, followed shortly thereafter by the invasion of Iraq. And moreover, the Chinese made the right noises, the right gestures, the right words of condolence, and the whole issue of China receded into the back, and to a point where on Taiwan, we had a man as president, Chen Shui-bian, who was pushing for Taiwan independence just at a time when we were so thoroughly entwined and occupied with the Middle East, pushing to the point where George W. Bush felt that this guy was such a pain in the neck. I could use another part of the anatomy, but he was such a pain in the neck that we just pulled him back from this advocacy of Taiwan independence and became very cool on this whole issue. And that, I would say, was an important factor in improving the relationship. Now, it's kind of scary that you have to depend on these unpredictable and momentous type of things to pull a relationship back. And what is it that makes the United States policy or attitude toward China so uneven, so up and down, up and down, up and down? Let me submit a few fundamental things, the misperceptions that I talk about. And this, the issue is driven from both the left on the American political spectrum and the right. And that's, in a way, makes it so potent. It's the whole spectrum of the American political body. On the right, you have this attitude, communist China. It is communist. We've had this tremendous democratic revolution. Communism is dead. It's only this little nut place of North Korea and China, this major thing. And so there's this sense of, well, communism has always been an anathema to the American public. And here is China, still communist. And the contrast, I'm talking now about the right. I'm talking about the people around George Bush. I'm talking about these descendants who are still around. The contrast is Taiwan, a democracy. We should be full in our support of Taiwan. These communists in China, the dictatorial, they're authoritarian. That's on the right. They grab women off the street and have them aborted if they're carrying children. They persecute the Christians on and on. On the left, you have the whole issue of human rights. This democracy thing, which kind of overlaps the whole American spectrum, but particularly human rights, human rights, human rights. Now, this is the view, and this is the underlying aspect that causes problems in the U.S.-China relation. There are other issues, which I will get to. But when you look at China, and you look at the reality of China, is China communist? Are you kidding? China abandoned communism long before the Soviet Union did. I mean, if you want a proper description of the system in China, it's not China with socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's what they call it. I mean, if you really want to put it in an objective thing, it's robber baron capitalism. That's what you have in China. This is what you had in the United States toward the end of the 19th century. And what does it bring? It brings corruption. It brings exploitation of labor. It brings environmental depredation. It brings wealth to the country. And it brings a better living to an awful lot of people. That's what you have going in China. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is do what you can to make money and advance yourself. That's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it has produced a tremendous economic revolution in China. What's going on is the American Industrial Revolution in fast forward. It's brought 400 million people above the poverty line. It has created the most massive and rapid urbanization of the country. And with it, it has also brought the problems that I already spoke to. But this is a vastly different and a much more prosperous China. And what does this do in the minds of the Chinese people? Whatever their particular dissatisfaction with whatever aspect of policy, there's a lot of restive farmers who feel, probably quite appropriately, that they're getting screwed out of their land by rapacious local government who are paying them far less than the land is worth, and it creates all kinds of incidents. You are having you're now having a real revolution in China, and it's called the Industrial Revolution, and with it, it's going to bring a lot of different kinds of problems associated with the Industrial Revolution in England and the Industrial Revolution in the United States. But it's not an indictment of the political system as such. It's a function of huge, rapid changes in society and social status. It's huge. Anyway, the question of human rights in China and of democracy. Number one, there is no tradition of human rights or of democracy. The Chinese tradition is where the community and the family come first. And the concept, the idea that the individual has any role in the governing process is just not there. Now, over time, I don't know, China is such a it's a changing society, as I said before. There are millions of Chinese going overseas. It used to take 6 months to get a passport to get out of China. You'd have to have your work committee authorization, your factory committee authorization. You'd have to give 2 cartons of cigarettes to Mr. Zhou and take care of Mr. Yang's kids, and then maybe you'd get the passports. Now you get a passport in 2 weeks. Millions of Chinese going overseas. Internet, everything's pouring in. Whether this and higher standard of living, higher levels of education. Now, whether over time this produces democracy, I don't know. It has already and will continue to produce a more open society. China now, compared to 30, 40 years ago, is you can do anything in China with the exception of criticizing the government or trying to organize political opposition. Now, to Americans, that's kind of great. But to Chinese, they've never really felt comfortable criticizing a government. For the last 50 years, 100 years, it's been dangerous to do that. But also, this concept that Americans will have, that sort of comparing the situation in China with the situation in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, a large number of intellectuals dissatisfied with the system, working against it, looking for international help, looking for Americans to come to their help, getting their message out. That was Russia. That is not China. The fact of the matter is, at least the fact of the matter to me, and if there are any issues on this, let's talk about it. Apart from a few very brave souls, very idealistic souls, the overwhelming majority of intellectuals in China, middle-class urbanites as well, is to rest comfortably with a degree of authoritarianism in China. And the reason for that is there's a fear of this inchoate mass. There's a fear of chaos. Chinese history of the last 100, 150 years has been chaotic. It is not chaotic now. And for the intellectuals to say, well, you get these mobs who are migrating into the city, you get these peasants, and this is a Chinese intellectual point of view. That's my reading of it in any event. You get these peasants agitating politically. Who knows what's going to happen to this country? And so, in their minds, it is more than a fair trade-off. They'll take the authoritarianism, particularly when it really doesn't grind on them. And they'll take the stability, and they'll take the policies of the government that have really changed the well-being of the Chinese people. Now, I don't know how much time we go on till, what, 9 o'clock? Is that it? Let me discuss Ming Dynasty. No, anyway, so that's the point. Now, on some of these arguments that you have, this whole question of religion in China, the so-called the persecution of Christians, and you will hear that from the right. That's a strong point. Christians are being persecuted. You want to buy a Bible in China, you can buy it almost any place. Christianity now in China is stronger and has by far the largest number of adherents than ever before in Chinese history. The estimates vary crazily because there's no real accurate count. Anywhere from 50 million to 80 million Christians in China. What the Chinese government doesn't want is foreign involvement in the Christian movement in China. During the communist era, Christianity had 3 strikes against it. There was the official ideology of atheism, which meant all religions were proscribed. Secondly, it was the imperialist association. And thirdly, it was that the only faith you're supposed to hold is in the thoughts of Chen Mao. Christianity now has only, well, I would only say half a strike. And the strike is, fine, you be a Christian, it has to be an approved a group, although I will tell you there are probably millions in underground Christian associations conducted by the Chinese by themselves. But the thing that the government watches, and watches very closely, is the foreign identification with Christianity. And the reason for that is historical. Because the association of missionary efforts in the 19th century is closely identified or is associated with gunboat diplomacy. That imperialism, to some extent, came in on the back of missionaries. You want Christianity? Fine, but no identification with foreign governments. And that's one of the reasons why China and the Vatican that the Chinese Catholicism does not acknowledge the supremacy of the Vatican. No foreign involvement. Now, that particular aspect is beginning to weaken. The Chinese government and the Vatican have been in negotiations, which for both these historically minded entities has been a short negotiation. It's only been running for 20-odd years, over the reestablishment of the Vatican supremacy over the Catholic Church in China. They probably will settle it, but it'll take another short time, maybe another 20 years, but they will settle it. So that's the take on religion. The other The other issues are this whole question of executions, hard treatment, everything that goes with that. And what you got to keep in mind when you look at China is that here is a nation coming out of what I would call a subsistence economy. 20, 30 years ago, 40. This was a society that for well over 100-odd years, you really had to work hard to merely stay alive. And this was a China of the famines, of the millions dying, of a life expectancy in the early 1950s of 35. Life expectancy now is in the 70s and growing. And in societies characterized by subsistence economies, it's man eat man. It's a cruel society. Look at England in the 17th century. Look at capital crimes of capital punishment. Any theft above 80 pence was a capital crime in 17th century UK. And so you have a China coming out of that, not all that far in the past. And there's still some aspects of this rather harsh attitude. But it's moving away from that. With greater wealth comes greater concern for the welfare of others, greater education, greater sensitivity. And this is beginning to happen in China. It's not going to happen by us yelling, complaining, protesting. It's going to happen in an evolutionary, bordering on revolutionary way by the changes now taking place in China. And I want to bring up this whole question of U.S. policy on the human rights issue. Now, I've given you the background on the Chinese concepts, but what's important here is to remember that China, like any other government, the Chinese government, it's not a monolith. There are some people in the Chinese government who are wonderfully sensitive, wonderfully concerned about their countrymen, want China to move ahead, be it on human rights, be it on more modernization, whatever you want to call it. But there's still an element in the Chinese government, just as there is an element in our government, what I would call the security aspect of the Chinese government and the security aspect of the American government. These are pretty hardline people. And the more you harp on the issue of human rights publicly, the more difficult you make it for those within the Chinese government, the open-minded, the progressive people within the Chinese government, to move ahead in making China a more open society. Because the argument used by, let's call them the conservatives in China, if you will, the reactionaries in China, is that we are not going to let foreigners tell us what to do. And if you are advocating this course because this country is putting pressure on you, you're nothing better than a running dog of American imperialism. So it's counterproductive. You've got to be sensitive to this issue. My sense is that the best message on human rights would be coming from other countries, not the United States. We've lectured too long, and we've lectured too loudly. And we've lectured to the point where we've annoyed a lot of people in China. Even to those intellectuals who favor greater human rights, the attitude now is, enough. We're not going to take your lecturing anymore. We are no longer the China of 20 years ago. We're standing up. Enough is enough. Now, that is not the most helpful attitude on either side of the equation, but that's reality. So if you have issues on human rights, hopefully other countries will carry the ball. And wisely, if it's really a burning issue, you do it privately and quietly. Now, let me very briefly get into a couple of major issues which are troubling Americans and give you my take on them. One is, of course, the economic rise of China. You know, this sense on the part of many Americans that it's like a ball game. You know, we're number one, we're number one. China's growth, China's economic development, it's not a zero-sum game. The more prosperous China gets, the greater economic strength China gets, the more we will benefit from it. When you look at patterns of trade, the United States' largest trading partner is Canada. Two prosperous trading entities working together are far more beneficial than just third world China, U.S. It's, as China, you're already beginning to see a trend in trade figures between China and the United States. And this trend is U.S. exports to China are growing at a larger percentage rate than U.S. imports from China. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a horrendous deficit in trade with China, because the U.S. exports start from a very low base, and Chinese exports to the United States start from a very high base. But the trend is there. And this whole question of whether China sort of becomes the economic Godzilla of the world and swallows our lunch, very reminiscent to what happened in the 1980s in terms of Japan, if you recall that. Here was Japan, it was buying Rockefeller Center, it was doing this, it was doing that, it was buying almost everything except the Minnesota Twins, because nobody wants to buy them. Anyway, well, the Timberwolves, I should say. Couldn't give them away. But there was this sense, and books were written on it, and movies were made, of the unstoppable Japanese economic monster. Now you're getting that in terms of China. I don't know. Never run straight-line projections. I mean, China's done a tremendous job, and its policies in dealing with the recession have been very successful. But China's going to be facing some problems in the future. And one of the problems is that China has a very rapidly aging population. It's not only this one child per family policy. That's pretty almost dwindling out. What's happening is that as China urbanizes, the family size is coming down dramatically. That happened in Japan in the 1950s. It happened in Taiwan in the 1970s. Hong Kong has got an aging problem worse than Japan, and China is going to have this aging problem. This is according to a UN paper right now, there are 6 working people for every retired, for supporting one elder in China. In 30, 35 years, there will be 2 working people supporting one elderly person in China. So they're going to have a big issue of productivity, labor force, everything associated with this phenomenon of aging, including, by the way, a gradual reduction of the population of China. The other issue is that China is going to be up with competition. As China develops economically, and we've already seen some of this, wage rates go up, other countries become cheaper. And now some of your shoes are being made in, who knows, Indonesia. The shirts are being made in Bangladesh. So China's going to be faced with that same issue in a way that Japan was. Is they've got to find another level of economic opportunity. It's just you can't operate or look at a country at fear over the possibility that it's going to make tremendous economic progress. That future is way out, uncertain, and as I said before, it's not a zero-sum game. But the real, of course, issue is that China's economic power grows, so grows its political power, so grows its military power. And there you get, again, this whole issue of China as a major military power and references to increasing Chinese military expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the United States military defense budget is over $600 billion. The Chinese defense budget, these are 2009, and their estimates, and it is such a fuzzy figure, the Chinese defense budget. There's so many different ways to calculate it, but it's about $89 billion. A lot of that is going to improve living conditions of the People's Liberation Army. And a lot of that is part and parcel of what I would call international life. You show me any country that once it gets some degree of economic success, where the military doesn't reach out for a larger source of resources. It's almost a law of international relations, and that's what's happening in China. The issue, of course, is to look at what Chinese policy is. If you think that by looking at what China is, and that it is incumbent on the United States to somehow contain China or see to it that it doesn't achieve this type of success and view it as the potential threat, and if that shapes your policies, you will have an enemy. If you regard somebody as an enemy, you certainly will have an enemy, because they will respond to that. Europe is not sitting and shivering and sucking its thumb over China's economic development or military development. Neighboring Asia is tied up with China in all kinds of beneficial economic relations. If the United States were to adopt a hostile policy toward China, we would be, as we were in the era of George Bush, unilaterally acting without allies, without friends. So these are some of the things that trouble me. Now, I look at Chinese policy with all the impressive advances, and they are impressive. If you travel in China and go to the countryside and go to the western part of China, you will see poverty. And there's still poverty there. And the per capita income in China is about $6,000 a year, whereas compared to the United States, it's $47,000. And yes, China will likely overtake Japan as the second largest GDP in the world, if not 2010, certainly by 2011. The Chinese GDP is about 4-point-something trillion. Ours is 14 trillion. There's still a disparity there. But the point is that, one, China has a long way to go, and two, their focus is on that segment of the society that has been left behind by all these developments. And there's no social network, social safety net in China. this aging population. They are focusing on economic development. That is still, without doubt, their primary objective. And they are not a steamroller. They are having great problems in Africa because the way they carry out their policies or the economic activities in Africa, they're human. There are some issues in terms of how the Chinese now are viewing the world. The Chinese are very proud of their accomplishment. And while, as I've just made this call for tolerance and understanding of a different system, on the part of the Chinese, we're not beginning to see this kind of tolerance. When the Chinese come and complain to Western governments about how the press, be it in the United States, be it in the UK, be it in Germany, are criticizing China, denouncing China, are supporting the Dalai Lama, are favoring the Uyghurs, etc., etc. The Chinese government and the Chinese people have to realize that free press and that right to criticize is something that is inherent in the Western cultures, and the governments can't do a damn thing about it, and better not try to do a damn thing about it, and so you can't get that kind of thing. And the Chinese also have to realize, their treatment of national minorities, they are where we were 80 years ago. You want to be nice to these minorities, you turn them into little Chinese. You want to be nice to the American Indian, Native Americans, you take them up, bring them into boarding school, and make them little Americans. Well, it didn't really work in the United States. But this, for the Chinese, for those who are sensitive and caring on the issue of minorities, it is still a policy of what we had 80, 100 years ago. There's a certain insensitivity on this whole question of minorities. I can go on and on and on, but it's getting late, huh? I've spoken for a long time. Let me throw it open to questions on any issue. And if I don't have an answer, if I can't answer it, Yongwei will answer for me.
Yeah, this is working. We can accommodate a few questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, please come over here and use this microphone. Yes, please.
I can't see.
I'm sure you would have gotten to it sooner or later had you kept talking, but I'm wondering what your opinion is on why the U.S. is proceeding with arms sales to Taiwan.
Oh, I should have gotten into the Taiwan issue. The arms sales to Taiwan have been in the works for a number of years. And the reason why they didn't go forward was that the Taiwan legislative yuan didn't approve of them. Now, they are a function, at least my reading, of pressure on the administration by the defense industry in the United States. We're talking about some $6 billion. And also by, as I say, the political right wants to make sure that we take care of the security of Taiwan, even though many on Taiwan really didn't want the arms. These arms sales are a violation of the Shanghai Communique. That communique was first violated in 1991 or 2 by George Herbert Walker Bush as he was running a very hard and not too successful campaign against Bill Clinton. There was some concern about winning the state of Texas, which had a I forget which aircraft company, which producing F-16s. And George Herbert Walker Bush approved the sale of F-16 airplanes to Taiwan. This is an advanced airplane. Now, the Shanghai Communique, which I have here, the United States government states that it does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan, that its arms, this is 1982, that its arms sales to Taiwan will not exceed either in qualitative or in quantitative terms the level of those supplied in recent years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and China, and that it intends to reduce gradually its sales of arms to Taiwan, leading over a period of time to a final resolution. In so stating, the United States acknowledges China's consistent position regarding the thorough settlement of this issue. So no matter how you color it, this is applied. The first violation in 1991-92, China averted its gaze. And the reason was very simple. China wanted George Bush I to win the election. It feared a Clinton administration, so it didn't say a word. That established a precedent, and from time to time, we have moved in this direction. Now, China has reacted. It's reacted very strongly. My reading, it's a verbal reaction. They've taken steps. They're not going to be meeting between the military and things of that sort, and that will probably, that situation will persist for another year or so. But if I'm sitting in Beijing and I'm thinking those foolish Americans and blah, 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 I'm still very satisfied with the way Taiwan situation is evolving. And for that, it's very clear. Now, Taiwan and China are one economy. They are inseparable. And so Taiwan is not about to do anything which would destroy its economy. Secondly, the elections in Taiwan a couple of years ago defeated the pro-independence party and put in place a fellow who is from mainland China and whose ideas are getting along with China and let the future kind of take care of itself. What has happened is a very interesting evolution of attitudes in China, in Taiwan. Taiwan, 15, 20 years ago, looking back, we want no part of that mainland. Number one, they've gone through all these crazy political movements. They ripped themselves apart. They created all kinds of problems for themselves with the Cultural Revolution and mistreated so many people. Number two, even though they're a reform program now, who knows how consistent it's going to be. Number three, they're poor. They're very poor. They're backward. If we have any type of association with them, they're going to be, we're going to have to support them, essentially. Awful lot of the Taiwanese economy is going to have to go toward alleviating the backward state of the Chinese economy. This is changing. First of all, it's been a long time since the Cultural Revolution. Secondly, what has happened in China has been eye-popping to the people of Taiwan. 30 years ago, somebody from Taiwan going to Shanghai, going to Beijing, going into the major cities and say, hey, this is the way we were in the 1960s. You know, these guys are really behind. Nowadays, you go to Beijing and you go to Shanghai and you come from Taipei and you say, hey, Taipei looks pretty much like a provincial city compared to what's going on. So there's less of a psychological barrier. Now, there still is, and I think China realizes that, and it should realize it, there still are memories, historical memories of the way the mainlanders came into Taiwan in 1946 and mistreated the people of Taiwan and deprived the people of Taiwan, the local people of Taiwan, of their political rights for 30-odd years, 40 years. And there's still memories of how the Chinese behaved in their radical manifestation. These are there. Over time, they're easing, and as I say, the tremendous economic success of China has eased some of these other concerns. So the thing is moving in a very favorable direction. The Taiwan as a flashpoint, as a possible source of conflict between China and the United States, which was there right through into the 1990s, that is receding. If I had to bet on it, and don't put too much stock in my bets because I bet on the Indianapolis Colts, but if I had to bet on it, I mean, I think the outcome of this Taiwan-China thing will be some form of federation or commonwealth arrangement. And that, and the way things are going, should prompt one huge sigh of relief on the part of the United States, who got caught up in this Taiwan thing because of that huge mistake on both sides during the Korean War. That's a long answer to a short question. Sorry.
What is China's policy towards religious minorities like unregistered churches and religious groups who proselytize or conduct public worship? And I'm not speaking of foreign influenced, but native churches.
Very good, very good. China's policy, these religious groups are unregistered and therefore are illegal. And in many societies, if something is illegal by law, action is taken against it. But in China, what the law says and what actually happens is not always the same thing. In many areas, these unregistered churches go on without any problems whatsoever. These little house churches, no problems whatsoever. In other areas, and this all depends on local authorities, to what extent they enforce the law regulations. In other areas, they are proscribed and they are vigorously acted against. Now, it's interesting. If you were to take a, what do they call it, acetate, something overlay of a map of China and put it over those areas where the Boxer Rebellion was at its strongest, where most of the missionaries were killed or most of the churches were burned, you will find a relative correspondence between those regions that are more vigorous in enforcing regulations against underground churches as compared to other regions. So it's an inconsistent picture. The only consistency is that there are certain areas which have had a long history of a xenophobic reaction to foreign religions, and that's it. Let me say something. I don't know. How much time do we have here, huh?
Very much.
Not very much. I want to say one thing. Two more questions. All right, let me answer the questions.
All right, briefly, you discussed, you just stated that there were some economic policies of China and Africa, and I was wondering if you could more so elaborate on those policies versus the moral implications of them.
In Africa?
Yes.
Okay. China's got involved in a lot of projects in Africa, and quite a few of them are extracting natural resources, commodities, and things like that. And what the Chinese have done as a practice is send over Chinese workers. Instead of hiring locally, instead of relying on local labor, providing more employment opportunities, almost from the ground up, it's all Chinese. And these Chinese workers have come over, and you get somebody, say, who comes right out of the middle of Hubei or Sichuan and put them in Africa, they're pretty much going to cling together, stay together, and deal together, and it's aroused antagonism, fairly widespread. The Chinese business practices in Africa have aroused African nationalism and antagonism. That's about it.
First of all, thank you for your talk tonight. It was very informative, and I want to thank you for challenging our perceptions and our beliefs about what China is. Got me to look at things a little differently. I was looking at that bridge on the overhead there all night and thinking about what a relationship is, and to me, a healthy relationship is trust and a degree of faith even, and the opposite of that is mistrust and fear.
Right.
Now, in a global economy, as China develops its resources, there seems to be a fear in America that we're not on a level playing field. And, I'm talking about developing resources and paying attention to the environment and sustainability. And how do we build a solid relationship, when it comes to the global economy and not tearing up Mother Earth? Thank you.
That's a very good question. And I hope I have a halfway decent answer. China is moving smartly on environmental issues. Until a few years ago, they didn't give a damn about the environment. And it is still a mess out there. I mean, I tell people who are going to Beijing to visit China, I say, bring cigarettes with you, because smoking cigarettes in Beijing is healthier than breathing the air around you. But China is finally cognizant of that. In the last few years, there's been an explosion of interest in renewable energy, in solar energy, in wind power. The Chinese attitude is that we are too poor. We have been too poor to have much concern about the environment. That persisted until every damn river in China is polluted. Every agricultural field is littered with plastic bags. There's a huge shortage of water resources in North China. And all of this finally is coming into very sharp focus for the Chinese leadership, and they're moving smartly on it. Now, they're still going to be relying on coal, and it's still going to be a huge problem, but at least they recognize it and they're beginning to do something about it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Stay put. We have something else for you.
At this point, I would like to invite Mr. Bob Griffin. And we would like to have a picture taken. Where's Professor Sheridan? Meredith, you want to come up?
Oh, please don't.
You want to
That'd be very
stand up? Yeah. Yeah, almost.
I just would like to also first thank the ambassador for a wonderful lecture this evening. I thought it was wonderful. I hope you did as well. I thought it was very interesting. I'd also like to thank the China Center and their efforts tonight for arranging this, Yong Wei and the staff. And I would also like to encourage everybody to support the Red Pocket program that's in the back of the room and some of the other efforts that are happening at the China Center. It's a wonderful resource we have at the University of Minnesota. So I would encourage you to support that. I'd also like to give them a round of applause, if I may. And lastly, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you. This is the ninth in this lecture series, ninth effort in this lecture series. And we've been very fortunate to have such wonderful guest lecturers. And I've seen many, many of you over the years, and I really appreciate you keep coming back. And I hope that the efforts on behalf of the China Center and the lectures that we have inspired you to treat and listen to and admire Chinese activities and Chinese policies and Chinese growth and Chinese importance in our lives as Americans, and help build better bridges between us and them. So I want to thank you all again, and I want to wish you all a Happy New Year. Thank you.
And please do stay. The reception area is behind the partition walls. We have a lot of food tonight, so enjoy the conversation, enjoy the food. Happy Chinese New Year.
Can I get a picture of the three of you on stage in the right line?